All right, so today, obviously, the question is to vote or not to vote. And specifically, it is, should Indigenous people vote in the federal election? And this is, for those of you who are outsiders of the community, it is actually a contentious issue in the Native community and one that's being debated right now. And I think the reason that it's come to a head is because of the terrible relationship between the federal government and especially First Nations communities, but Indigenous communities of all sorts across the country. Because if I ask this room, are you guys overwhelmingly supportive of the Conservative government, you would say? No! All right. So it's not me iterating my personal political views, it's just an observation that I've made, being the super insightful person that I am. Right? So there's this undercurrent to the discussion that's going on that's anybody but Harper, anybody but the Conservatives, right? ABC. But then it also comes within a longer historical context, of debates around voting and sovereignty, about the right to vote and all that. So we hope to delve deep into some of those issues here today with our esteemed panelists. So first off, to my far right, we have Leah Gazan, who's a member of our Faculty of Education here at the University of Winnipeg. She's also super active in the community. I'm sure you've seen her either in her work at the Social Planning Council or with Idle No More Manitoba, or even refusing to say the name Enbridge on our campus here over the years. And if you want to tweet at her while she's talking, it's at Leah Gaz on Twitter. So everybody, give a warm welcome to Leah Gazan. And to my right, we've got Dr. Rob Ennis, who's joining us from the University of Saskatchewan, where he's a graduate chair in Indigenous Studies and an assistant prof. His book is actually for sale at the back of the room if you want to visit our friends from the U of M Press, and it's called The Elder Brother and the Law of the People. And so it's an examination of identity and membership on the Cowessess First Nation, and using the stories about Wisagajak and Nanabuju to kind of examine how the kinship relationships in the community overlap, intersect, and sometimes conflict with those imposed by the Indian Act and Bill C-31. So it's a super cool book. And if you want to tweet at him during the discussion, it's at Innes_Rob. So everybody, please give Dr. Innes a very warm welcome. And last but not least, because she's got the most degrees of anyone up here, Dr. Pam Palmater. She is the chair of Indigenous Governance at Ryerson University, where she's also an associate professor. She's got her doctorate in science of law. She's called to the bar in 1998, member of the Indigenous Bar Association, and is the author of Beyond Blood, but also has a new book coming out called Indigenous Nationhood, Empowering Grassroots Citizens. And there's a chapter in here called Don't Vote. So she's going to be talking about that. But if you want to come up here and grab one of these after the talk, then you'll be able to track down her book when it comes out in just a few weeks, I believe. And if you want to tweet at her, during the conversation, it's at Pam_Palmater on Twitter. All right, so please welcome Pam to the stage. So just in terms of what we're going to do, we're going to start up here with a little bit of a discussion, and then we'll open it up to the floor, and we'll take questions from all of you here in attendance. So I think the best place to start is just with the question, should Indigenous people vote in federal elections? So we're going to have everyone up here just take turns answering that, and we'll begin with Rob. So I'll ask you, Dr. Ennis, should Indigenous people vote in Canadian federal elections?
Thank you, Rob Canoe, for inviting me here and to be a part of this timely discussion. I'd like to acknowledge being on Treaty 1 territory in Métis homeland. Anytime I get the opportunity to come back to Winnipeg, this is where I grew up, and I jump at the opportunity, and especially being able to be on the panel with these two women. I'm pretty honored to be here. In this election, we'll see more Native people voting than in any other previous election. And there's a number of reasons why that is. Certainly, the level of political engagement that was as a result of the Out on the Moor movement, which was born out of the response to the implementation of Bill C-45 and the increased engagement of Indigenous people, especially Indigenous youth, is unprecedented. And I think that for many Indigenous people, there is and certainly not all, but for many Indigenous people, there is a recognition that the kinds of policies and legislation that the current government has implemented has not only undermined the social well-being of Indigenous people, but really has been an attack on Indigenous sovereignty. And when we see, for example, the amendment that the Bill C-45 did to the Indian Act itself, in the way that it made it very easy for reserves to be sold off and really attacking First Nation democracy and undermining the level of accountability for chief and council, opening them up for really influenced by third-party interests. That, in itself would be for anybody who wants to be, who cares about their treaties and their treaty lands, the reserve lands, that in itself would be a wake-up call. But of course, that's not all. I mean, it's not. People are recognizing that it's not just an attack on sovereignty. These are not just the political component of the federal government, but it's the social component, the cutting of funding towards women's organization, Native women's organization, the way in which the Prime Minister has really slapped Indigenous peoples in the face by saying that Indigenous women's lives is not high on his radar. I mean, these are kinds of issues that has really resonated with many Indigenous people, and really has engendered them to become more politically involved. I mean, even with many Indigenous people have recognized that the way in which the government has responded to the refugee crisis also has been something that has come up. But one of the things I've noticed is that for many Indigenous people, many want to vote anything but conservative, and they want to take a strategic stance in terms of who should they vote for, the NDP or the Liberals. And I think that's really a reflection on the kind of way these two parties have outlined their Aboriginal policy. For example, both parties have said they want to take a nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous people, but they haven't really said how. What does that mean? Right? And I think that, one way would be for either party to say, all these pieces of legislation that the federal government has implemented in the last 3 years, they should repeal. And then we can start from here and go and move forward in a nation-to-nation basis on how we will deal with Indigenous groups. However, because neither party, although both parties have announced major policies, NDP want to reinstate funding to Indigenous women's organizations. Both want to launch the inquiry to missing and murdered Indigenous women. Liberals are going to put in millions of dollars into education. These are all these aren't bad. These are not, but there's a lot of things that they haven't spoken to yet, and I think because of that, there's a lot of Indigenous people we're just going to go, which we're just going to vote strategically. And I think it's up to to these parties to say exactly what are they going to do, try and win the vote of Indigenous people, rather than sit back and just let them come to them.
What do you think on a personal level? Should Indigenous people vote in this election?
Well, I think that given the attack on Indigenous sovereignty and on the social policies, I think that for myself, I think it's voting is one way, one piece of the toolkit of resistance. And it's not the end game. This is not going to change the system, but it will hopefully put a party in place that will assist Indigenous people, many of who live in poverty. And I think and because the federal government has really attacked poor people and Indigenous people, majority or many of them are living in poverty, I think that it's in our interest in the short term to vote.
All right, miigwech. All right, Pam, why don't I ask you the same question? Should Indigenous people vote in federal elections?
Thanks for welcoming here back to this territory. I'm honored, and I want to acknowledge all the grassroots people and students and faculty and friends and our two Grand Chiefs here. I think it's really important that we do have this conversation in a good way, because at the end of the day, it's not us versus us. This whole nation-to-nation relationship that went off the rails did so by one party, and certainly not by our hand. And so the direct answer to that question, which should be no surprise by now, I guess, is that I'm not in favor of voting, personally. I don't tell other people not to vote. I don't tell other people don't run in an election. I don't tell other people what to do. But people often ask me, why don't I vote? What's my rationale? What are my concerns? And that's what I'd like to respectfully share. I have two major concerns with voting. One is the sovereignty issue, and I come at it from a legal perspective. Every single thing we say and do can and is used against us in a court of law. Everything. Every piece of paper we sign, everything we do. Moving off reserve is considered the breakup of the historic band that once used to exist and will now be used against you in land claims. Every single thing we do. So I don't think that voting alone kills our sovereignty. I don't think anything can kill our sovereignty as long as there's one of us left standing defending our territory. That's my position. However, there is something called death by 1,000 cuts. And if we're going to move forward and we're going to be stronger and we're really going to be rooted in this nation-to-nation relationship, then all these little things count. And I think voting in someone else's system is not part of exercising our sovereignty. And I agree with Indigenous philosophers like Dr. Alfred and John Trudell and many of them that have come before us saying, we have got to stop feeding the beast. The people that oppress us, use us, manipulate us, and dispossess us of everything, not just our lands and resources, because we get focused on that, but our women and our children and our identity and our language and even our right to say any of this. For being outspoken on murdered and missing Indigenous women, I'm labeled the top 5 to fear Canadian. I mean, it's really, we're not in a good way. So how best to go forward? So I have a lot of sovereignty-based issues because I do see Justice Canada entering more and more of these things into evidence. And at some point in time, I am concerned about the legal implications of it. On the other side is the practicality. So, because my kids ask me this question. They ask me these things all the time. Shouldn't we vote to get out Harper? I think we should do lots of things to get out Harper. But to what end? When you vote, what do you get? What do you get? Anybody who votes in here, anybody for any party, and it could be some random party that gets elected, you're voting for your next Minister of Indian Affairs. That will not change in this election or the next election, and probably not the next election. I am never going to vote for someone to control me in every aspect of my life from birth to death. I simply won't do it. If a party came up and said, we're changing everything, we're doing a 180, we are going to turn this ship around. We recognize your sovereignty as the Mi'kmaq Nation, and that's how we're going to move forward. Well, then we have something to talk about with the treaty partner. Until then, why would I support their system? Why would I put an ounce of energy into a system that oppresses us and dispossesses us? And I understand why people would. I understand it's like working in the federal government, like I used to do. You want to make change. However, let's just infiltrate them all and make change from the inside. But politics doesn't work that way. You don't vote for the prime minister. It's not like voting for a chief. In a First Nation, one vote counts. In Canada, one vote does not count. You don't ever vote for the prime minister. In fact, you vote for your party, and if your local MP is a crook, a convicted felon, but you want that party to be elected, you have to vote for that person. That's not real democracy, and it's certainly not the way Indigenous people think about leadership. And so I worry about the effect that it has on us by participating in that system. And then I guess my own personal one is my father fought in the Second World War, and I often asked him, why would you do that? Why would you fight for them? And he always said, I didn't fight for them. My ancestors signed a treaty, and we promised to be allies. They promised to fashion us with weapons and ammunition, respect our territory, and we would fight alongside of them in defense of this territory. I didn't fight for the vote. I didn't fight for anything, but I promised the Queen we would jointly protect this territory, and that's what I did. And he said, our relationship is based on treaties. Now, not all First Nations have treaties, but we're on the same basic relationship where we promise to live together and mutually protect and respect one another. And our relationship was set for us. Our ancestors said, our nations are going to engage with your nation in this way. Not we will submit to your process. And then if we roll the dice and win in the election, hopefully there'll be change. But 2/3 of us are not going to win in this gamble. And then what do? Then we can't really run back and say, but it's a treaty relationship. I'd rather come to the negotiating table as the strong sovereign nation that we are than come as a submissive. And that's just my personal point of view. But like I said, I respect those who want to vote and who want to participate. I mean, look at Elijah Harper. Elijah Harper made an incredible difference. Look at, Romeo Saganash, who's trying to, bring in UNDRIP and advocate on our issues. There's really good Indigenous people trying to make a difference on the inside. And I know what that's like. I tried. But me personally, I'm a no.
All right. Surprising. Wasn't sure what you were going to say. All right, Leah, can we have you answer the question as to whether Indigenous people should vote in the federal election?
So I was wondering why I didn't have a microphone, Wob. I was kind of taking it personally. But Buju, Heyushka, Washdewi, Red Sky Woman, Indigenous Kazmakwa, Dodem, Wood Mountain Lakota Nation, Treaty 4 Territory. I just want to welcome all the elders today in leadership and Grand Chief Derek Nepanak and our first woman Grand Chief of the North, Sheila North Wilson. And it's an honor to be here on Treaty 1 territory, but also to work on Treaty 1 territory. And I just want to say, Wob, I'm really humbled by your introduction. You know, sometimes I'm so busy working, I don't even realize what I've done in my life because I'm always working. But I'm very humbled by your introduction and know that much of the knowledge I have is actually not from my colonial education, but from people sitting in this room who I've sat in with ceremonies and stood on front lines with. And so I want to acknowledge everybody here today. I know many of you, and Rock the Voters and all of the youth here as well. Want to acknowledge you today. So I wrote a piece today and I call it Ode to the Fascist. So I'm going to share it.
It's subtle,
I figure since Bill C-51's gone through and I have about 5 minutes left before I become the resident scholar in Stony Mountain, I might as well give it all I got. So here we go. I teach at a university and I pay taxes that are used to support a fascist. I pay taxes when I go shopping. I use the Canadian medical system. I receive mail in my mailbox. Some are even from crown corporations such as Manitoba Hydro, so I can keep heat in my home, where I pay property taxes that pay for the roads that I drive on to get to work every day. I have to carry a passport when I travel internationally. I have to file taxes or I go to the slammer. And if I speed on my way to work, I can potentially receive a speeding ticket that I have to pay or my car will be impounded. I use Canadian currency. I have a colonial education that has allowed me to participate in a Western-based colonial economy. Even those individuals who are not working and forced to live on employment and income assistance, as high as 90% or more in some of our Indigenous nations, have become pawns of the federal government who decide whether they will provide adequate levels of income for housing, to maintain food security, have clean drinking water, a westernized Eurocentric education, and any other basic need to ensure fundamental human rights are realized. It is the reality many of our Indigenous nations are living under as a result of a paternalistic and abusive Indian Act that continues to impact our daily lives and our ability to truly realize a level of sovereignty that our ancestors so bravely fought for. And I have become dependent on that colonial economy due to the fact that environmental destruction caused by aggressive resource extraction and development has impacted my ability, even if I wanted to or knew how to exercise my right to hunt and fish on my ancestral lands. Unfortunately, my sovereignty has been compromised by the colonial state and a brutal colonization, so that I feel forced but still choose to participate in colonial structures that have been imposed upon us and been imposed upon our vibrant Indigenous nation, including my active participation as a faculty member in a colonial institution. We need to get real about our current reality and our own participation so that we can have an honest discussion about how to ensure the survival of our inherent rights. You can't move forward if you don't honestly acknowledge where you are. So I will vote. But my vote will not be a vote against my sovereignty. My vote will be against our current government that has a strong stench of fascism. I will also vote as a way to exercise my relationship with our treaty partners. I want to say about who is on the other side of the table. And just a shot there about, you were talking about Dakota, and although I'm Lakota, Wob, I just want to say, even though we never surrendered, so I'm at adhesion to treaty. So I want to talk about a few thoughts about treaty. So treaties were signed to define our relationship with one another. They were not signed so that one nation could have power over another nation, very much like my respected colleague Pam indicated before. But unfortunately, that has not occurred, so it's understandable why many Indigenous people choose not to vote. Why would you vote if you feel like you're not heard, or even when the very foundations of our relationship that were supposed to be honored in treaties have not been? However, voting is a way we have to say and communicate how we desire that relationship to pan out. I want to say about who will be at the negotiating table when I'm asserting my sovereignty. I want to ensure that the person or the power sitting on the other side of the table does not totally disregard my sovereignty as an Indigenous person. And that's happening right now under the Harper regime, where time and time again, he has tried to impose laws and pass bills that disregard my inherent rights as an Indigenous person that were practiced prior to British legal traditions and prior to treaties. It is sovereignty that I have that comes from the land, not from people, not from governments. So I don't feel like I give up my sovereignty by voting. My sovereignty as an Indigenous woman is defined by my relationship with the Creator and exercised through how I nurture my relationships with our lands, water, plants, animals, my elders, and my community. So I want to say about who's sitting on the other side of the treaty tables when I insert my inherent sovereignty on my ancestral lands. I want to make sure the person sitting on the other side of the table has a greater focus than further financing a corporate oligarchy that has demonstrated a complete disregard for our environment through an aggressive push for pipeline development, kind of like what's happening in British Columbia, where Indigenous leadership, and that includes leaders like Frida Houston from the Unistoten camp, are ready to take a stand to ensure the protection of our lands and our waters against the pipeline. Or the fact that there's over 1,200 murdered and missing women and an epidemic number of missing men and boys, and a current government that has indicated quite clearly that they are not going to act in spite of pressure coming from the United Nations, Amnesty International, and Human Rights Watch. There is no other party running in this federal election that agrees. So I will vote. My vote will not be a vote against my sovereignty. My sovereignty is between me, the Creator, my elders, and all life on Mother Earth, not the Canadian court system, nor anyone else. I will make a vote against what I think smells of a current fascist government whose laws and aggressive corporate agenda at all costs will lead to the extinction of my ability to exercise my sovereignty on my ancestral lands. So I will vote. Thank you.
All right. Oh, you guys are fired up. Nothing gets a crowd rocking like a history lesson, so why don't we go back into time here? I was wondering, Rob, if you could talk to us a bit, because some of Dr. Ennis's research is into the World War II veterans returning to Saskatchewan. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how that generation impacted, I guess, civil liberties generally, but specifically the right to vote for First Nations people in Canada.
I'm not shaking when I'm pouring it either. Veterans, First Nations veterans were allowed to vote when they came back as part of one of the benefits that they received, and there's no real evidence to show, the level of voter participation among veterans. However, what we do know is that veterans, especially by the 1960s, were really heavily involved in political and social activism. Many of the friendship centers, or some of the friendship centers at least, that were organized in Regina and Saskatoon or Winnipeg had veterans involved in them. There were certainly in Saskatchewan from the 1960s after John Tutusas, the next 4 leaders of the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations were veterans, either Second World War veterans or Korean War veterans. So the level of political engagement that was happening with First Nations communities in Saskatchewan, at least, was really, veterans were in the vanguard of that. They were a part of that. They were certainly, especially from the 1960s on. And many veterans I talked to about 25 veterans in my research for my master's, and although we didn't talk specifically about voting, voting did come up in part of conversations, and some that I talked to were very adamant about voting. Others were, didn't really participate in voting, but nonetheless, the ones that were voting, they're pretty adamant about that they went and to Europe and fought to help liberate Europe, and that one guy had mentioned that this was one way that he was going to help, and he felt he could help. Now, it would have been, if I had been thinking about voting that when I was interviewing them, that would have been it would have been a lot helpful to this discussion. But really, when I was looking at their social and political activism and the influence on Saskatchewan during that time period. So, and it's very difficult to know for a fact, the voter participation rate. So, yeah, that's basically what I can say about that in terms of voting and First Nations veterans. I do know that, like I said, that one veteran was very adamant about voting, but that's not enough to say that they were,
Because what I've heard is that it was that generation that got us the right to vote in 1960 in Canada. Would you agree with that assessment?
No, I wouldn't agree with that assessment. I would say the reason why Canada gave, or some would say imposed, voting on First Nations people really had little to do with First Nations people, but really more to do with the image of Canada in the world in the post-Second War era. So, it really wasn't something that First Nations people desired or thought about. And really, it was Canada. We're a free-loving country. We believe in democracy. Wait a second, you're First Nations people there don't vote. So how can you be? So it had really more to do with Canada and their image, and it was very highly contentious, with some leaders like John Tutusas being against voting, but other leaders were for voting.
All right, thanks. Pam, I was curious to know, because like a lot of what you spoke about was around, the attacks to Indigenous sovereignty or Indigenous nationhood, depending on how you want to phrase that. But I was curious to know, whether you feel the same way about voting in Indian Act elections.
That's a really good question, because we've had Indian Act elections imposed on our traditional governments. In many of our Indigenous nations, it has completely superseded our traditional governments, whereas in other Indigenous nations, like the Mi'kmaq and Mohawk, the two operate side by side. No one more powerful than the other. One is used as a tool to make sure funding mechanisms aren't cut off. Meanwhile, all of the decisions of major importance, things around sovereignty, land, and treaty rights, they're all done by the traditional government. And so it's not the same in every territory. We have a scenario where if you do not elect a chief and council under the Indian Act and under Indian Affairs policies, they can and will put you under their intervention policy, which means anything up to third-party management where you have no say in what happens financially in your community. Many First Nation leaders that I've talked to, because this is a core issue for many traditional leaders, how do we get around this? Many of the leaders use it strategically to make sure their people don't suffer while they advocate on the treaty and sovereignty side, and other First Nation leaders have given up hope that it's going to change anytime soon and resign themselves to that. So it's not the same in each First Nation. Certainly I come from the Mi'kmaq Nation, where our Mi'kmaq Grand Council is our government. So we're not threatened by the little community Indian Act elections because our government is still the government. We use those strategically. But if I can, I'd like to follow up on
Sure.
what Rob was saying in terms of why we have the right to vote. And I think it's really important that people know the history. It's like when I wrote my book on Beyond Blood, and I do a lot of presentations on Indian status. Once people understand how Indian status was created and where it comes from, it's a lot more repulsive than you think at first, because you think, oh, it's just an administrative tool, and it was never designed as an administrative tool. Similarly, voting, which wasn't being widely advocated by First Nations across the country when it came in. It simply wasn't. The facts are there. Because we were still very much treaty nations, sovereign nations without treaties. The reason why Canada imposed voting on us was because after the Second World War, the whole world was talking about genocide. What is genocide? When does it occur? How many people have to die? What kinds of acts do you have to do? Who's guilty of it? Who can be prosecuted? Who can bring a claim? Canada was one of 2 countries that held out signing on to the Convention Against the Crime of Genocide, and very strenuously advocated all of the other countries against this Convention on Genocide, and were very much responsible for eliminating cultural genocide from the international convention that we have today. That's very much linked to why we have the right to vote. Because citizens cannot bring a claim of genocide against their country, just like citizens can't sign treaties with their countries. It doesn't work that way under international law. Everyone's talking genocide. We have sovereign nations in our territory in Canada and the United States. So all of a sudden, we're made citizens. And this happened before we had the right to vote. But then all of a sudden, we're citizens without the right to vote. And you have this Bill of Rights conundrum. How are you going to deal with that? These discussions were never had with First Nations. But this is why we have the right to vote today. No one gave it to us. It wasn't a gift. It was imposed on us to prevent international claims of genocide being brought against Canada. And so that doesn't sit well with me. Too many of our people have died from scalping and forced sterilizations and in residential schools for me to celebrate that. And that's just a personal thing. But knowing that history makes a difference for me. It's not a gift. It was to prevent us from showing the world what has happened and continues to happen in this country, and especially in Manitoba.
I want to go to Leah real quick, but can you just clarify why you say especially Manitoba?
I say especially Manitoba because I think history shows Manitoba in many ways has been the heart of resistance, the heart of defending territory, defending governments, and defending sovereignty. And so Manitoba has been specifically targeted. And if you look at any of the socioeconomic indicators, who has the largest number of kids in care? It's Manitoba. Who has the largest number of murdered and missing Indigenous women, very close, Saskatchewan and Manitoba. You look at it all, look at the northern Manitoba First Nations. The strongest in their culture, the strongest in their language still, and suffered some of the worst effects of residential schools. Manitoba was a target for a reason, and if you haven't read any of the reports by the security officials that work for Harper, Manitoba is still considered to be the ultimate access point for Canada. It is Canada's weak spot. For us, it's our strength. We could literally control everything. Traffic, business, economy, politics, law, you name it. Manitoba is that central access. That's why Manitobans are targeted. That's why there's the worst socioeconomic conditions here. And that's why I'm saying stop feeding the beast and take back control over our territory.
All right, Leah. So we'll move into audience questions shortly. If you guys have a question, you can come up to the mic. But before we do that, I was wondering, Leah, if we could just broaden the discussion out a little bit, instead of just specifically focused on Indigenous people, just focus it more broadly on young people in general. Because like when I talk to people my age, not necessarily Native people, their attitude is, all those politicians are fake. None of them speak to my reality. Why would I bother voting for any of them? Because none of those guys are real. None of those guys grew up the way I did. None of those guys ever come to my neighborhood. So I was wondering if you could respond to that criticism about voting and how it doesn't really speak to the level that a lot of young people, some of whom are Indigenous, are on.
Thank you for the question. I think that shows in the last federal election with the voting turnout. I think it was like 38% that got a guy that starts with the letter H that I said starts with a word that starts with the letter F. So anyway, I think, getting out the vote is really important. But one of the things that I learned in my life with my parents, like we talk about what we learned in academic institutions, but most of the most valuable, value-based decisions I learned in my family and my community. And one of the things that I learned was silence is a very strong political statement. Silence is a very dangerous statement because when you're silent, you're allowing something to happen. Like, for example, when you go in Winnipeg, and I know this is being broadcast nationally, but we have a street in Winnipeg called Main Street. And there's violence that happens on Main Street all the time. And it is a visual representation of that violent colonial relationship that has resulted in the social disruption of many of people in our community. And one of the things that I notice, and I talk about this often, is people just drive by. Like, for example, we talk about violence against Indigenous women, and I see women getting abused on the street all the time, and people drive by. In fact, sometimes I even see people who are intoxicated going across the street and falling down, and people will drive around them in their vehicles. That's what I mean by silence being a strong statement. That's what I mean by silence being dangerous. So, voting, whether it's in a colonial system or not, like, I'm not saying that I'm happy that as a result of this brutal, violent colonial relationship that I vote. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is that I want to say through my vote that I want a kinder person in charge, a kinder person that values women's rights, that doesn't cut all the funding from women's organization. And if you don't vote, you silence your voice. And that is a really strong statement. Even if you go in and vote and you put a big X through your ballot saying, I don't want to participate, I'm not voting for any of them because I think they're a hooey, that is still a statement. But go and vote. That's how I feel. I'm going to go and vote. Now, I'm not going to tell you what to do. I just told you what to do, and I was like, I shouldn't tell people what to do. Okay, so I'm not going to tell you what to do, because I was told I can only speak for myself, and I just told you what to do. So I'm not going to tell you what to do. But I'm going to tell you what I'm doing, and I'm going to vote. So, thanks.
Well, now I don't know what to think about the issue now. All right, so if you guys want to ask some questions of the panelists, you maybe want to come to the microphone, Leonard, just so we can, you can go first if you want. Look at this, he's got a stack of papers too. So this is Leonard Monkman. Yeah, this is my microphone, you better back up.
Hello.
Yeah, so this is Leonard Monkman. He's from Aboriginal Youth Opportunities, one of our young up-and-coming leaders.
So I feel like much of what is happening here in Manitoba is very much a continued assault on Indigenous identity. The problems that we see up north, the problems that we see in inner city is very much a way of continuing that assault that has happened on Indigenous people over the course of the last couple hundred years. Democracy is a way of dividing people. You see the split in our community with the Liberals and the NDP. How do we go about real change if proportional representation is implemented within the next election, if that's possible? I know parties talk about it, but never really go through on it. I think that we would be able to solve much more of our problems if we stood together as a collective instead of standing behind one party and dividing our people in half or three quarters. Indian Act, democracy, politics, all of that kind of stuff divides us. My question is for Pam. Pam, I kind of love you a little bit.
Everyone giggles because they do too.
What do you think about, as a possibility, an Aboriginal party or an Indigenous party federally that would be able to possibly keep the rest of Parliament honest? Do you see that as a possibility if we had something like proportional representation in terms of keeping the government honest?
That's a really good question, because if you look at New Zealand as an example, the Maori Party, which is one party, actually can have significant influence over what happens by which other party they tend to make a coalition with, for example. So in that specific scenario where they have their own party and guaranteed seats, that makes a huge difference. But I think your other question was the most impactful. We're all talking about vote or not vote. I think the real question which you asked is, what do we do to make the big difference? And in my opinion is, forget about all the problems in Canadian democracy. Who are the most vocal people in this territory? It's Indigenous people. Look at Idle No More. Could you ever accuse any of the tens of thousands of people that acted in Idle No More as being silent? Of course not. And here's the thing, if you look in history at everything that we've done, so we've voted in elections and we've got, Minister of Indian Affairs, and we've survived Prime Minister after Prime Minister. Where have we been most effective? And we have 100% success rate, 100%, when we resist something and we stand behind it. So we defeated the white paper with no money, no funding from the federal government, not voting in elections. How? By piling 20 people to a car, living on bannock and jam sandwiches, and traveling across the country telling people, no, we're not going to do this. We defeated Meech Lake Accord. There were thousands of protests across the country. We defeated the First Nations Governance Act. The Mohawks stood up for their territory in Oka against the Canadian military. The whole world now knows we're here and there's a problem here. Look at all of the grassroots women for murdered and missing Indigenous women. When I travel around internationally to the United Nations or to any place to speak on any issue, people are like, wow, look at those women and what they're doing. And they're not politicians, they're not, many of them aren't academics, they're not lawyers, they're not anything that the colonial system recognizes as power. But Harper's biggest weakness is our collective power. So you hit it right on the head. Our collective power can stop any of this stuff. We can withdraw from any of these processes that aren't working for us, and we could literally go back and take all of our kids right now if we wanted to do so. But it's about us. We have to believe in us again. It's not some MP that's going to save us. We're going to save us.
Thanks.
I hear what you're saying, but what about C-45 and C-38 in 2012, and then C-51 last year? I hear what you're saying about the collective standing together, but I think maybe the 100% figure is not accurate.
It's 100%. We never lose when we stand up.
But in 2012, everyone opposed C-45 and C-38, and then
Yep.
they were...
And C-45 is dying a slow death. It's already in litigation. It's already lost in Mikisew Cree, and it will be defeated.
I don't know.
It will.
I'm skeptical. I think if a sitting government repeals it or changes the law, that would change. But yeah, just want to fact check that 100% figure.
It's 100%.
Vote now on Twitter. Is it 100% or not?
Hi, Pam. My name is Clifford Sinclair. I'm a student here at the University of Winnipeg, and I'm from Puckatawagan Cree Nation. And it's kind of directed at you, but I would like to hear answers from also Leah and Rob. So with regards to not voting, what you said has a lot of truth, but we are having to evolve in a society where we are not the dominant force anymore. So if we don't take advantage of a system in place where we are heard, what do? More blockades and protests? Until First Nations are on a united front through our own national organizations, what do? This is a dilemma that I personally fight with. This is why I vote, because until my voice is heard by our own organizations, specifically organizations like MKO, AFN, AMC, right? I was at the previous AFN shouting and screaming because they wouldn't let me speak.
Maybe that's why they didn't let you speak.
Yeah, sorry, I'll make it quick. And my voice carries no weight. But at least in the federal election, I can vote, I can talk, I can speak, I am heard. So I guess my final question is, yeah, like, what are your thoughts on that? Thank you.
I agree with you. There's a lot of mechanisms that definitely aren't working, and the most important thing that we can do is withdraw from those things that aren't working. So, for example, there's tons of negotiating tables across the country that you only get to sit at the negotiating table if you agree to extinguishment of your rights. We don't have to agree to that. And I will differ with you on one thing. We are the dominant force in this territory. We always have been and we always will be, or we wouldn't be here right now. They've thrown everything at us: scalping, forced sterilizations, missing and murdered Indigenous women, deaths in police custody, residential schools, 40% death rates, and we are still here dancing in the streets saying this is our territory and we're going to take care of it. And people are listening. I know it doesn't happen overnight, and people tend to think sometimes that with voting, there, I got my party in, all's good. But the Pope told the world, what will save this earth? Indigenous peoples will save this earth because they're actually part of the land and love the land, and no one cares about the land more than those people. They don't treat it like commodities, and that was the Pope's word. David Suzuki, who's been a lifelong environmentalist, and environmentalists were always seen as that's going to be the solution, and he himself has said, no, it's not us environmentalists. It's Indigenous peoples that are going to save the earth. So we actually have a bigger job than just who's going to be the next politician. It's our job to save our territory, but also to save the rest of the earth. And so I believe we actually are the dominant force, and other people are beginning to see it. If only we can get the rest of us to believe in that again, then we can defeat those colonial thinkers and move forward and do these things. And I think the biggest thing to do is withdraw from those processes. We don't have to do any of those processes that we're not happy with.
Can I?
Sure. Go ahead. And if there's other questions from the floor, we probably have time for a couple more. But yeah, Leah, do you want to add to that?
Okay, sure. I absolutely believe that we're probably the most, Indigenous people are probably the most powerful political force on Turtle Island right now. I totally agree with you on that. The reality, though, is even when you're talking about defeating things like Bill C-45, you still defer to the colonial system of the courts by indicating about winning. See, I don't think voting it makes a difference in that regard. Because, as I said earlier, my sovereignty isn't defined by those systems. My sovereignty is defined by my relationship with Creator, the relationship that I have with the land. My vote is one of the tools that I have in my toolkit to get rid of somebody currently in government that I believe reeks of fascism. So that doesn't mean that I vote because I think that the other leaders don't have a colonial air, because I'm not naive. I would agree with you on that point. But I don't think that we can, at this point in time, look at our options and say there's not a clear difference. We have, and people know my political leanings. I was born from a hippie that would make my political leanings more of a certain way. However,
Not green.
none of these none of the other parties have taken the kind of strong stands that Harper has taken and tried to implement it through very aggressive bills, including the latest one, Bill C-51, which poses a threat to all of us, including those people standing on the front lines, which I have been doing for my life. I bumped into, during the MKO election, a guy that I camped with out during the Oka crisis, okay? And there was certain things in place at the time, so even though they were taking pictures of us, because there was 2 of us there at the Manitoba Ledge in the tent before a couple of other people came, they couldn't drag me off to jail. So there's very staunch differences now. I can't pretend, as somebody who gets paid, files taxes, teaches in Western universities, that I am not participating, because that would be not being honest with you, and I am. I drove a car here, I filled it with gas, I take the bus, and until I'm like Chickadee Richard, who has figured out a way to live off $35 a week and is trying to get rid of all of that, then I am not honestly practicing my sovereignty until I get off that corporate colonial grid. So
I don't know. That might be a too absolutist understanding of Indigenous ways of living.
Well, you know
I don't
what?
think they're necessarily completely mutually exclusive.
Yeah, well, you know what, Wop, I'm right, and just kidding.
Do you want to ask a question? Maybe just a quick intro who you are, and then...
Sure.
dive right
My
in.
name's Josh, and I'm just representing myself here. But at the beginning comments there, Dr. Ennis, you said that there may well be an unprecedented level of participation and interest from Aboriginal and Indigenous voters in this election. And it reminds me that there may be some countervailing tendencies there. And it reminds me that for those who are advocating that Indigenous people don't vote in this election, there's perhaps some unlikely allies there from the current government who have imposed restrictions to make it harder for Indigenous people to vote, with changes to the Fair Election Act, getting rid of identifications and vouching, and all kinds of barriers that the government's putting in people's way of voting. And maybe for good reason. You know, if you see remember at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it was Harper's minister who didn't stand up among everybody in the room in support of those recommendations. And so I think one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, how do we get over those barriers, and what can we be doing to encourage people to have to give people access to their rights to votes, whether they choose to access that right or not. We really need to make sure that everybody does have access to those rights. I just wondered if any of you have any comments on that.
Maybe Rob, we haven't heard from you in a while.
Okay, thanks. There are a number of communities, number of reserves, First Nations who are working very hard. The chief and councils are working really hard to help people navigate those processes. and as well in a number of urban centers here in Winnipeg and in Saskatoon, there are local Indigenous people who are working through social media to try and encourage people to vote, giving them guidelines or steps to help them. So I think there are a number of people from various communities who are trying to work and to help people who want to vote to make it easier and insist them to vote. So I think that people recognize that the government has implemented voter suppression, especially within a lot of reserves where there are no addresses, and how do you get a piece ID with your address on it? Those kinds of things. So, but there, I've seen a number of communities work to alleviate that.
That's good. All right, thanks, Rob.
And that's one of the reasons why I think that there's going to be a larger voter participation this year. Because there's actually a lot more people talking about how can we help people vote.
I hope you're right.
Yeah. Very good.
Hi, my name is Andrea. I just completed my MA in political studies, centering on citizenship. And my question is really for all of you, but perhaps more directed at Dr. Palmater. What do you say to people who, like myself, I consider myself a dual citizen? I'm a member of a First Nation community in Manitoba, and from my paternal ancestry, I'm Canadian. So my question is, in your opinion, does my voting and participating in this colonial system from my patriarchal ancestry invalidate my indigeneity, or should I have to choose? I believe strongly in the sovereignty of both, and I would like to know your opinions on my participation in both of these nations to which I feel I'm part of.
That's a great question.
I don't think anything can nullify your indigeneity. That's on you, that's within you, and there's a lot of exterior factors trying to combat that. As we all know in here, anything to stop us from, being with our core strength, which is our indigeneity. So no, I don't think voting does anything to your indigeneity. And there's actually a lot of people. The National Chief Perry Bellegarde of the AFN believes in dual citizenship. He believes you can have Canadian citizenship and Mohawk or Cree or some other citizenship and use them strategically. So to me, it's not a right or wrong thing, and I would never tell you to not do something. I do a lot of, let's do this, let's do that, but I would never tell you in your own personal life, don't do something. I just have such strong feelings about not voting for these reasons, because I think it's a multitude of issues that wears away at it, but there's lots of support for that dual citizenship concept.
Yeah, just because, I was just thinking that there's a lot of people in my situation because of how relationships have overlapped, and growing of our treaty relationship between the people, that there's so many people like me who feel a part of both systems. So
and
that's
it works
sort of my question to
internationally
everyone.
too. There's lots of people with dual citizenship. So there's some Canadians that have the right to vote in the U.S. And I'm sure they go down there and have fun and vote in the U.S. elections too, or in UK elections, without, hampering their status as a citizen in another country.
No, thank you.
All right. So maybe that's a note that we can close on then, because take the same idea and just expand it beyond people with mixed ancestry, and just think like, so for instance, me, right? Like I'm, a member of the Ojibways of Enigaming First Nation, right? But I also live here, right? And so there's issues that concern my life here, even though I am concerned with treaty rights and harvesting wild rice and, hunting and fishing and practicing the Medewan and the Sweat Lodge and the pipe and all that. But I also care about the quality of the streets that I drive on. I care about the quality of schools, public schools that my kids go to. I care about the healthcare system. I care about these issues that are determined by the federal, provincial, civic governments. So maybe could we just we'll just go around the horn one more time and have everyone reflect on, does that fact that people are not clearly engaged in one or the other, and a completely indigenized existence or a completely westernized existence, does it mean that maybe we should adopt a similarly kind of spectrum-based approach to whether or not to vote? And maybe we'll do reverse order. So we'll begin with Leah this time and then end with Rob.
Well, I think I stated my opinion in my ode to getting out the fascist, but which is, you know, the reality of my life is that I've been forced to function in all sorts of worlds that both impact me. Like I was saying, the roads, I had mentioned the roads and the schools. And so, yeah, I think that's our current reality, and that's why I'm voting. That doesn't mean that I don't honor sovereignty, but I also have to be realistic about my current reality as an Indigenous person living on Turtle Island that lives in a city, that lives in a house, that pays property taxes for my kid, like you said, to go to public school. And I want to say in that, but not just for my own family, but also for my community. I'm not okay with the fact that currently there's a housing crisis across this country, that our children continue to live without clean drinking water, toilets, housing, education. And so I want to make sure that people who make decisions, because I'm in a position of privilege, you see. So it's really easy for me to sit here and tell you, like, to vote or not vote, because I'm sitting here in privilege. I have a job, I have a roof over my head, I'm not having food security issues, and I have a toilet that I get to flush when I go home, on the backs of Shoal Lake 40, who has been under a water boil advisory.
And 39.
And 39. But I am going to place a vote in, not just for my own good, but to make sure that people who are making decisions about other people living throughout Turtle Island also are afforded those fundamental rights.
So Pam, do you see room for like shades of gray between don't vote and yes vote?
No. But here's the thing. I mean,
What is interesting though, because you started by saying it's death by 1,000 cuts, right? So it seems to me that it implies that there's like a spectrum of like things that are terrible affronts to sovereignty, things that are less serious. So I'm wondering how you square that.
Maybe if you voted with without prejudice on top of the ballot that said, you know, without prejudice to my sovereignty, I'm going to consider this like a driver's license and vote. But I don't know that there's really any way to save it. But that being said, I think your point is really important, that, you know, we're all going to have these differences of opinions, as we should, because we're diverse Indigenous nations and treaty partners. But more than that, there's no such thing as a pure Indigenous person or a pure colonial person. And I don't even agree that, you know, going to a school is colonial. We have had the exact same things that every other country and state and people have had. We've had our own Indigenous knowledges, our languages, our sciences, our maths, all of these things. We've had our own economies, we had our own governments, our own laws. All of these things haven't gone anywhere. So simply moving forward in our governance or our economies, however we do that, is not colonial. We've always done that. And so I don't know that you need to have a spectrum for vote. I mean, because at the end of the day, you're either going to vote or you're not.
Yeah.
There's no spectrum there. But it doesn't mean you're not Indigenous if you vote. And similarly, just because you don't vote doesn't mean you're acting in a sovereign way. It's the collective of everything that we do. And voting is just one thing. But it's also not the only way to exercise your voice. So by not voting, you're not being silent. Would anyone accuse me or you, Wob, of being silent? Even if we don't vote? I wouldn't think so. Or anybody in this room, or all of the women that march in the streets for murdered and missing Indigenous women. None of them have to vote, and they've all exercised their voice. So I just think we have to leave it open, that there's a whole range of things that we can do, either instead of voting or in addition to voting, to protect our sovereignty.
And Rob, maybe if you want to bring it home for us here, in terms of just also maybe
Well, you know,
if you do see it that way, though, like, why this time, you know?
Well, you know, for me, you know, I grew up here in Winnipeg, a single mother who was, you know, worked 2 or 3 jobs. We struggled. We were moving all the time. I myself didn't graduate high school. I didn't know anybody who graduated high school. I didn't know anybody who had books in their houses, let alone, you know, were studying books. So for me, to think about a pathway out of poverty, there was no pathway. There was no pathway. There was a pathway to jail. Now, I didn't go to jail, but many of my friends did. And I think that, you know, somehow along the way, you know, I ended up in a university going to school. I don't know why, because I never thought I could be successful in a university, you know, and I was somehow, and next thing you know, boom, I'm sitting here across from you, not in the audience, right, as a guy with a PhD. And so for me, when I look back and at my childhood, and I see, you know, living in Saskatoon and living in Saskatchewan, seeing that, you know, 50% of the people, at least that was the stats a few years back, in Regina and Saskatoon live in poverty. And I don't think for myself, I could say as someone, as a middle-class Indian with a secure job and a well-paying job, can say to people who are struggling because of policies by this particular government, that they should not vote, or that, you know, that this is then, and not that Pam is doing this, but, you know, I've seen, you know, some others in the, you know, internet world saying, you know, kind of forcing people to make a decision between their social location and their political location, trying to say, well, we have to now make a decision. Are you sovereign or not? And so it kind of putting on poor people the burden of that is really a middle-class Indian theoretical discussion. And I cannot do that. I cannot put that on poor people. You know, that knowing where I came from and knowing a lot of my friends came from, maybe a lot of you have come from, this is something I think that for me is one of the ways I view this.
How dare you? How dare you? How dare you put it on us rich Indians? All right, well, that's about it for the panel discussion. Richard, give a shout out. We were talking about veterans earlier. We got 2 young veterans in the back of the room here. They both served in the U.S. Marine Corps and Operation Iraqi Freedom, Enduring Freedom, and the Global War on Terrorism, right? And one of them is a student here at the University of Winnipeg, so we salute you guys. Thank you guys for your service. In terms of the panelists who are up here on stage, please check out Rob Ennis's book at the back of the room there, Elder Brother and the Law of the People, and come up and get one of these postcards or talk to Pam, and you can check out her second book, Indigenous Nationhood, Empowering Grassroots Citizens. And you can catch Leah on the campaign trail here, trying to encourage people to vote and all that. But real quick, before everyone leaves, let's do a vote here. Let me ask you, by show of hands, who is planning to vote in the upcoming federal election? Okay. All right. Who is planning to not vote in the upcoming federal election? All right. And who here is undecided about voting in the upcoming federal election? And who here is not old enough to vote in the upcoming federal election? There we go. All right, well, miigwech kapijayek, pedamaye pedo, wilalin, kinanaskomitin, and miigwech apachikapijayek and dinawe maganitok. Thank you guys for coming. Give them a round of applause one more time.